The moment Ethan walked into the restaurant, he noticed everyone was watching him. His friends had promised him a simple blind date, but they had left out one detail on purpose. The woman sitting alone at the corner table was a plus-size woman named Grace. Ethan stopped for a second, and the room seemed to hold its breath. What happened next was not what anyone expected. Within minutes, several people were wiping tears from their eyes, and Ethan himself would later admit that the evening changed the way he looked at people forever. If you believe kindness, compassion, and second chances can change someone's life, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and subscribe to Love and Destiny for more heart-touching stories. Ethan had never considered himself a cruel person. He worked as an assistant manager at a small hotel, took care of his elderly father, and tried to help people whenever he could. But like many people, he carried assumptions he had never really questioned. His friends Marcus and Daniel knew Ethan had been alone for years after a painful breakup, so they decided he needed to meet someone new. They arranged a blind date and kept the details deliberately vague, telling him only that she was kind, intelligent, and had a wonderful sense of humor. Ethan agreed mostly because he was tired of everyone asking why he was still single. When he entered the restaurant, he saw Grace immediately. She was sitting near the window, wearing a simple blue dress and holding a small handbag in her lap. She looked nervous. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked her phone, then placed it face down. She had clearly spent a long time preparing herself for the evening. Ethan could see the uncertainty in her expression even from across the room. For a brief moment, an old instinct told him to turn around and leave. He hated that instinct the second he felt it. Grace looked up and smiled when she realized he was her date. Ethan walked toward her, pulled out the chair, and sat down. The restaurant became strangely quiet because Marcus and Daniel were sitting at another table nearby, secretly watching. They expected Ethan to make an awkward excuse and leave. Instead, Ethan noticed something that changed everything. Grace had been trying to hide a photograph beside her handbag. When it slipped onto the table, Ethan saw a picture of a little girl wearing a hospital bracelet. Grace quickly picked it up and apologized, explaining that the girl was her younger sister, Sophie. Sophie had been seriously ill for several years, and Grace had spent much of her adult life helping her family. She worked during the day, cared for Sophie after school, and often put everyone else's needs before her own. The blind date was actually the first time in months that she had allowed herself to dress nicely and go somewhere simply because she wanted to. As Grace talked, Ethan stopped noticing anything about her appearance. He noticed the way her eyes brightened whenever she mentioned her sister. He noticed how she laughed at her own mistakes. He noticed how carefully she listened whenever he spoke about his father. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't pretending to be someone else. She was simply being honest. Then the evening took an unexpected turn. A waiter accidentally dropped a glass near their table. Grace startled, then laughed nervously and helped reassure him that everything was fine. Ethan smiled. She told him she had learned years ago that people sometimes made mistakes because they were frightened, tired, or simply human. That sentence stayed with him. Halfway through dinner, Ethan excused himself and walked toward the restroom. On his way, he passed Marcus and Daniel's table. They were whispering, expecting him to complain about the date. Ethan stopped beside them. Their smiles disappeared when he quietly asked why they had intentionally hidden Grace's appearance from him. Marcus admitted that they wanted to test him. They knew Ethan had become too focused on appearances after his previous relationship. They had hoped the surprise would teach him something, but they hadn't expected him to connect with Grace so quickly. Ethan looked toward Grace sitting alone by the window. She was staring outside, probably wondering whether he had left. Her shoulders were tense. For years, she had probably experienced people judging her before they ever bothered to know her. Ethan returned to the table. Grace immediately apologized, assuming something had gone wrong. She told him he didn't need to stay if he wasn't comfortable. She had heard enough cruel comments in her life to recognize the moment someone changed their mind after seeing her. Instead of walking away, Ethan did something simple. He pulled his chair closer and told her that he was sorry, not because she had done anything wrong, but because he had briefly allowed an unfair assumption to enter his mind. Grace stared at him. Ethan explained that the problem had never been her appearance. The problem had been his own shallow expectation of what a blind date was supposed to look like. He told her that in less than an hour, she had shown him more kindness, courage, humor, and compassion than many people he had known for years. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Then Ethan noticed something else. The restaurant had become quiet again. Marcus and Daniel were standing several feet away. They had heard everything. But they weren't the only ones listening. The elderly couple at the next table had stopped eating. The waiter stood nearby with tears in his eyes. Even the restaurant manager had paused at the doorway. Ethan didn't realize how powerful his words had sounded until he looked around. Grace wiped her eyes and smiled. She admitted that she had almost canceled the date because she was terrified of being judged. She had spent years believing that she needed to become someone else before she deserved to be treated with kindness. Ethan told her she never needed to earn basic respect. Then he did something that made the room completely silent. He stood up, walked toward Marcus and Daniel, and thanked them for arranging the date, but told them that if they truly wanted to help someone, they should never make another person feel like a test. People weren't experiments. They were human beings with histories, fears, dreams, and hearts. Marcus lowered his head. Daniel apologized to Grace. And then something unexpected happened. The elderly woman at the nearby table approached Grace and gently told her that she had raised 3 children and had spent half her life worrying about how other people saw her. She said she wished she had learned earlier that a person's worth was never measured by a reflection in a mirror. Grace began crying again. Ethan sat beside her, not because he wanted the attention of the room, but because he understood that sometimes the greatest kindness was simply refusing to let someone feel alone. The date continued for another 2 hours. They talked about family, childhood memories, embarrassing moments, dreams, and all the things people usually hide when trying to make a perfect first impression. By the time they left the restaurant, there was no dramatic promise about the future. There didn't need to be. Something more important had happened. Grace had walked into the restaurant expecting to be rejected because of how people might see her. She walked out knowing that at least one person had chosen to see her for who she was. And Ethan walked out realizing that the blind date had never really been about finding a partner. It had been about learning to look beyond appearances. Months later, Ethan still remembered that evening whenever he caught himself making assumptions about someone. He remembered Grace's nervous smile, her sister's photograph, and the silence that filled the restaurant when he finally said what many people were too afraid to admit: every human being deserves to be treated with dignity before anyone knows their story. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Love and Destiny. Your support helps these stories reach people who may need a reminder that kindness can change someone's entire day, and sometimes, someone's entire life. And before the story ends, comment, "Kindness sees the heart," if you believe we should judge people by their character, not by their appearance. Because sometimes, the person we are tempted to overlook is carrying the very story that could teach us how to become better human beings.